President Trump met with Prime Minister Netanyahu at the White House, and they rolled out a 20-point plan, which is to end the war between Israel and Gaza. And they had negotiated this with a number of Arab and Muslim countries. Now we're waiting to see if Hamas will accept this deal. What was your reaction to this plan? And do you think it will actually lead to an end to the war?
Well, my reaction to the plan is one of, I suppose, mixed feelings. On the one hand, it includes in the earliest stages the demand that Hamas release the remaining hostages who they've been holding on to for almost 2 years now, who they kidnapped and have been keeping in tunnels and elsewhere in Gaza. So the first thing is that if Hamas do agree to the deal and the remaining hostages are able to return home, that's, of course, a good thing. The mixed feelings come, among other things, because even that part of it comes with a familiar price, which is the demand that Israel release hundreds of convicted terrorists and others from Israeli prisons to return to Palestinian areas. And the reason why I say that's especially difficult to stomach is that, of course, this whole war and the atrocities of October the 7th came from just such an exchange some 14 years ago or so now, when in exchange for one kidnapped Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, Israel was persuaded to release more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, and they included Yahya Sinwar, the terrorist who was in an Israeli prison for murdering Palestinian citizens with his own hands, quite literally. He was released in the Shalit swap, and he went on, when he was back in Gaza, to reassume control of Hamas and to mastermind and orchestrate the October the 7th massacres. So many Israelis and many others look at this sort of a deal and say, how can this be happening again? How can there once again be the exchange of hundreds and hundreds of convicted terrorists in exchange for, in this case, some 49 alive and sadly dead bodies of totally innocent Israelis abducted from their homes on the morning of October 7th. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there's a whole slew of other parts of this proposal, and some of them are I have to say, pretty positive. There is at least an idea of what to do with post-war Gaza that isn't just the same as the sort of status quo that European politicians and others are very fond of, which is stop the Israelis from destroying Hamas, withdraw, pour in international money, and then let's see the same thing happen all over again. So that's a positive. But as ever with these sort of peace plans, it's a very mixed bag.
So when you look at this situation, and I'm looking at the points of this peace plan. Number one, Gaza will be a de-radicalized, terror-free zone that does not pose a threat to its neighbors. And that essentially is at the heart of everything that Israel has wanted for a very, very long time. There are measures in here that would allow members of Hamas to leave the area if they are seeking basically a new way of life. Also, Palestinians have the right to stay and be part of what is envisioned as a better Gaza, a more free Gaza, and one that potentially would have an economy, which it hasn't had in a very long time. So, your thoughts on that part of this situation. Is there any hope in here for Palestinians who would like to have a different future?
Well, firstly, if I may say so, I mean, the issue of the economy of Gaza did, of course, have an economy, not least through the billions and billions of dollars of aid that the United States, United Kingdom, EU countries and others poured into Gaza after the full Israeli withdrawal in 2005. The billions of dollars of our tax-paying money that went into the area. The problem is that, of course, the leadership who the Palestinians of Gaza voted in were Hamas, and they used all of our money to build their terror networks and indeed to make themselves all billionaires. It's something I mention in my book on democracies and death cults, that every one of the Hamas leaders who has been killed by Israel since the beginning of the October 7th war, died a multi-billionaire. And that's pretty astonishing. And that was because of our, as it were, generosity. If it was possible for Gaza to be de-radicalized and to have an actually functioning economy instead of being a basket case that relied on international aid, then that would, of course, be a good thing. But one of the problems here, of course, that everybody knows is the issue of whether or not Gaza can be de-radicalized. Hamas had an entire generation, 18 years, the length of time from a child's birth to the end of their formal education, to indoctrinate a new generation in Gaza into the belief that massacring their Israeli neighbors is the highest purpose in life. And again, that happened under the watch of, for instance, the United Nations. It was United Nations agencies like UNRWA who were meant to be in charge of this not happening. And they not just failed, but actually encouraged and legitimized the teaching of terrorism to the young people of Gaza. If it's possible, and President Trump's plan includes this, it seems that if it's possible for there to be some kind of body that makes sure that, who knows, that Gazans are able to be taught useful skills and knowledge and to actually be educated into improving their lives, that would, of course, be a tremendous thing. But we really, many of us who have seen this in cycles will wait for more, let's say, detail to be fleshed out before we know whether or not that's even plausible.
So what do you think about this board of peace that President Trump said he would lead? Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of the UK, is going to be instrumental in this if all of this goes through. And so first of all, let me ask you that. What do you think about that?
I'm positive about that proposal. I think that, inevitably it's received a lot of criticism. There are two things to be said about the two people we know already to be on it. The first, President Trump, as he said, is not like he doesn't need more things on his plate, but he's accepted this, and I suspect in part because he will remain the dominant figure in saying no to various of the countries in the region who try to push his peace plan beyond its own terms. I think he is the one with the best relations with all of the countries involved. Mm-hmm. To the extent he has good relations with, very, very good relations, of course, with the leadership in Israel, but also in the Gulf Arab countries, Saudi Arabia and other countries that will need to be involved. So I think the president's involvement is certainly a positive. The involvement of Tony Blair has received quite a lot of criticism, not least from people on the right. Tony Blair was an extremely successful, but Labour Party left-wing British Prime Minister. What I think those critics have ignored is that after leaving office as Prime Minister in the UK, Tony Blair went on for many years to lead the so-called quartet, European quartet, negotiations to try to see if a Palestinian state could be viable. So whatever one thinks of his term in office as prime minister, and there's plenty of criticism that can be made, Tony Blair is certainly a man who knows the region very well, and he has very, very good relations with multiple leaders and the trust of multiple leaders across the region. So actually, I think this, for all of the quibbles that people can make, I think that this is actually off to a pretty good start.
So what strikes me when I listened to President Trump yesterday, it reminded me a bit of the ultimatum that was given to Iran. 60 days, shut down the nuclear program, make that verifiable. And if that doesn't happen, then we will, then all bets are off. Essentially, you risk having that program bombed, which is indeed exactly what happened. So he sort of set up this scenario where you've been given an option. There is an off-ramp. If you don't take it, here's what's going to happen. I heard a similar message from President Trump yesterday, and it's clear in what was reported and written out of it is that Hamas, everyone's tired of this war. The war has to end. It's going to end one of two ways. Either you can accept this and you can give up leadership. You can give up any hope of ever having a leadership role in Gaza again, and you can walk away from this situation and stop fighting, or they will unleash, whatever needs to be done by Israel to ensure that that never happens militarily. Do you see that setup as being plausible?
It's a tricky one, that, because President Trump has made, as you rightly cite, the threat against the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Government of Iran's nuclear project. The threat of that was made by the president. The Iranian Revolutionary Government didn't comply, and the president bombed. In the case of Hamas and Gaza, it's a little bit more complicated, I think. And it's not like the nuclear issue wasn't complicated enough. The complication in Gaza is that Hamas know, or have known since October 7th, but actually they have known it since coming to power and before, that for them, an Israeli, a Jewish hostage is the best thing in the world. Holding, implausible as this might sound to us in the West as a mindset, they believe their best chances of not just living, but of winning is holding on to Jews living and dead. And so they've known that the moment that they gave up the remaining hostages, it was perfectly possible that Israel would then go in and finish the job on Hamas. The bit of the plan that gives effectively an amnesty to members of Hamas who lay down their arms and leave changes that somewhat. But we'll wait to see whether or not Hamas actually trusts that. And whether or not they believe that if they do give up what, again, it's sick to think of it like this, but these are sick people in Hamas, what they think of as their prized jewels, if they give up the emaciated hostages and the dead bodies of hostages, they know that they have no more leverage, really. And so that's going to be a calculation Hamas are going to have to make. But Hamas, it can't be stressed enough. I mean, in all of these negotiations, it's been my view always that Hamas did not want a deal, and that they played and toyed with Israel, with America, with all of the Middle Eastern countries. They toyed with the idea that they wanted a deal. What Hamas want is to keep holding hostages and to do October 7th again and again, which is what their leadership have consistently said. If they take the deal, that could change. But one of the many questions in post-war Gaza will be, how can it be ensured, not just that Hamas don't come back to power ever, but that no Hamas 2.0, if you like, entity comes to power? And that is going to require incredibly careful policing and oversight.
You know, it's such a different world now, though, post the Iran decimation of Iran's nuclear weapons program, the killing of the leadership of Hezbollah and Hamas, and the wounding of the Houthis and their abilities. So now that Iran is in such a weakened position, how does Hamas, I mean, they really think that they can just keep going at this? They have lost so many of their fighters. Their entire strip is crumbled into pieces. And there has to come a point when young Palestinians look at this and say, look, Hamas has not done us any good at all. And maybe there is some hope for a future for our children.
You know, that's an extremely difficult calculation. And I'd say several things. One is that one of the reasons why elections haven't been held in Judea and Samaria and the Palestinian portions of the West Bank, as they call it, is that it's known by the Palestinian Authority that for years, if there had been elections, Hamas would have won elections in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. And so I wouldn't underestimate the potential popularity of Hamas among Palestinians, including the Palestinians in Gaza. The second thing in that is that we have, and again, those of us who have followed and observed this conflict and seen it up close for a long time, know that there is a cycle to it which has to be broken, but which the breaking of which lies in the hands of the Palestinian people primarily. And that is the old question that Golda Meir, former Israeli prime minister, cited half a century ago now, which was that the moment would come of peace when the Palestinian Arabs stopped teaching their children to hate and to kill their neighbors and instead taught them to live in peace with them. Until that day comes, until that, it's not a political shift, it's actually an attitude, society shift that has to be learned, adopted by the Palestinians of Gaza and indeed in the West Bank. it has to be accepted by these people that they are not going to eradicate their neighbor Israel, and that after almost 80 years, it is high time that the Palestinians accepted what they should have accepted in 1948 and indeed before, which is that they can have a state. They could have statehood. They could have their self-governance they already have extended. But it is the prerequisite of that is that they accept that they must build their own societies and not try to eradicate their neighboring societies. And as Golda Meir said 50 years ago, it's the same thing tragically today.
You know, it strikes me the similarities. I interviewed the president of Iran last week, and when you look at the similarities of what has driven these societies, and it's the fight, essentially, and not the economy, not improving things for the people of your country. And really the only thing that can change that, and this echoes what Golda Meir said and what you're citing from her as well, is that until you have a generation that doesn't want this anymore and wants something better, nothing really changes. But you do see this isolation. And I thought it was very interesting that President Trump is saying, you know, maybe Iran could be part of the Abraham Accords. And that is not just for the ears of the supreme leader. It's for the ears of potentially, you know, Iranians who can pick it up somewhere on social media.
Yes, absolutely. I thought it was very smart to say that because, yes, I mean, you know, as you know, but many people don't. I mean, Israel and Iran used to, until the Iranian Revolution in 1979, used to have diplomatic relations.
Yep.
There are still Israeli diplomats alive who served as Israeli diplomats in Tehran.
That's right.
The moment that the revolutionary government came into power, the Ayatollah Khomeini seized power in 1979 and started slaughtering his political opponents. The moment that happened, as I say on Democracies and Death Cults, the moment that started, the 1979 revolution started, was really the beginning of a total reversal of the progress that had been going on in the Middle East. It saw the revolutionaries of the Khomeinist movement colonize vast swathes of the region, colonize and destabilize Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Gaza. And if the Iranian revolutionary government does indeed feel on the back foot and somewhat defanged, seeing all of these proxy armies that it's been training up for years so decimated, as you say, and if popular opinion, including at home in Iran, was able to turn against them, then that would be the real unlocking of the puzzle of the present Middle East. You know, almost all of my life, I've heard politicians of left and right claim that Middle East peace could only be assured in the whole region. The whole region could only progress if the Israelis and the Palestinians only came to a two-state solution. And that paradigm, which John Kerry, George W. Bush, and many others pushed for years, it didn't matter which side of the equation, was flat out wrong. It was proved to be flat out wrong because, firstly, you could solve the Israeli-Palestinian territorial dispute and the economy of Yemen would still not blossom. You know, it wouldn't lead to women getting equal rights in Iran, for instance, or anything like it. So the first thing was that was demonstrably wrong. The second thing was that Donald Trump's Abraham Accords showed that in actual fact, you could normalize relations in the region without needing to solve the perhaps intractable Israeli-Palestinian territorial dispute. And so that was a very important discovery when in Trump's first term he managed to do the success of the Abraham Accords. As you mentioned, if only other countries were able to join, and if, crucially, Iran were to be persuaded through whatever means, and different people have different views on that, through whatever means to stop, if the Iranians could be persuaded to stop spreading their revolution across the region, radicalizing the region, destabilizing the region, then many of the problems, including many of the problems that the Palestinian peoples have had, could be solved in the foreseeable future. And something that we thought could not be solved in our lifetimes would, like the Abraham Accords, be solved potentially within a presidential term.
So there is a sense in recent months that, and the reporting, I think, has had an impact on this, that Netanyahu is driving this war further than he needed to, that what's happening in Gaza is so horrific that no matter where you stand on this situation, you should want to see some relief for the people of Gaza. And I've also had, officials in Jordan talk about the fact that, they want to see that they don't believe that being anti-Netanyahu's government is being anti-Semitic. Your thoughts on this development, which, over the last few months, it has shifted in public opinion?
Yeah, I would just say on the matter of the Jordanians, being critical of Benjamin Netanyahu is not anti-Semitic, but giving sanctuary to a female bomber who blew up a bus in Jerusalem some 20 years ago with a lot of innocent people on the bus, and then being given sanctuary by Jordan, I would think that does count as anti-Semitic. So the Jordanians are total hypocrites, like the Qataris, on this stuff. The question on Netanyahu and the war is very important. Israel had two war aims from the beginning, which were the release of the hostages stolen by Hamas and the destruction of Hamas as a fighting and indeed governing force in Gaza. Those are the two war aims. And, many people, many miles away from the war, people like President Macron in France, Prime Minister Keir Starmer in London, and others, seem to have, they've got this thing where they've got domestic political pressure from their Muslim populations and from others. And they've decided that in under 2 years, despite Israel not having achieved its aims, they believe that Israel should stop the war despite not having achieved those aims. That is just weak leadership. If you set out with aims in a war, you either have to achieve those aims and win the war, or you have to give up. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has decided not to give up, and certainly not to decide to allow Hamas to remain in power, still holding Israeli hostages, just because, people like the corrupt, royal family in Qatar and, Prime Minister Starmer and a few others say that he should. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, whatever criticisms you can make of him, has been doing is just to be consistent throughout this war and to know that sometimes in war it takes time to achieve your objectives. But the most important thing is not the time it takes, but whether or not you do win those objectives and actually win the war, or whether you're persuaded, as Israel has been persuaded so many times in the past, to wrestle defeat from the jaws of near victory and effectively allow your opponents and your enemies to regroup and do the same thing again. And that is clearly what Prime Minister Netanyahu has been dedicated to stopping happening.
Douglas, I want to ask your thoughts on a totally different subject as a last question here. And that is about the New York City mayor's race, which shifted this week. Eric Adams, the current mayor, has dropped out of the race. There is a push to bring more money into the Cuomo campaign on the part of those who want to thwart Mamdani from becoming the mayor of America's biggest city. What's your take on Mamdani and on this race?
Well, I think that it's an extremely important moment for New Yorkers. And there's several reasons for that. A lot of people have focused, understandably, on Mamdani and his failure to, for instance, criticize terrorist chants like calls for intifada and so on. And that is shocking. I mean, it is shocking that we just passed the 24th anniversary of 9/11. And it is shocking that, we got a taste in New York, a really big taste of what intifada means in 2001. And the idea that in 2005 New Yorkers would vote for somebody who believes that calling for intifada is a perfectly reasonable part of the political process is deeply shocking. The larger question, though, in a way, with Mamdani is, apart from that, is he's totally unqualified. He's never run anything. He comes from an extremely privileged background, father, a Columbia University professor. He tried to make it as a rapper for a time, and that didn't work. He's had minimal experience other than that, outside of low level of politics. The idea that Zohran Mamdani is in any way qualified to run the world's greatest city is just insane. And the people who think that, you might as well give him a go, fresh face and so on, that is so naive, to put it at its best, I think. And I just would add one other thing. I think a lot of New York voters, I know very well, overestimate the extent to which New York will always remain a sort of the world's financial and other capital. They massively exaggerate the extent to which that will always be the case. In fact, if you have poor leadership, even for 4 years, that chases wealth out of the city, that boasts about wanting to chase wealth out, that boasts of, for instance, very racially ugly things like taxing white neighborhoods more. If you see that divisive thing, if you see a mayor coming in who believes that he can give stuff away for free and that that's cost free, people underestimate the extent to which, of course, in America, people can move around very easily, and capital can move around easily, and people can move to other states very, very easily in a way in which it isn't the case in countries outside America. And I do believe that New York will see a deadly flow of talent, capital, and much more if Mamdani were to become mayor.
Yeah.
And New York would pay the price. And it wouldn't take a mere 4 years to recover from that. It would take many, many years. Britain, where I'm from originally, of course, has elected a Labour government that has chased out thousands and thousands of multimillionaires through its tax policies. And you can already see the effect that is having on the British economy. It's devastating.
Absolutely.
And it'll be the same with New York, but it'll be that on steroids.
Yeah, there was a time when London was a bigger financial capital than New York. You saw a lot of migration of those firms. I know a lot of American firms who closed up their offices in London not that long ago and moved them to other places. We've seen people migrate across the river to New Jersey. They're going to Texas. A lot of movement already. And I don't doubt that your assessment is accurate. Thank you so much, Douglas Murray. Great to talk to you. As always, the book, your most recent book, is On Democracies and Death Cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization. Douglas, thank you so much for your time today.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.